We started out with sin, and then we spent a couple of weeks on sacrifice, and I want to commend you people for staying awake. I know that sacrifice is a dry subject, but it's also a very important subject. And it even carries down to us because Paul said that we are to present our bodies as living sacrifices. Those animals that died throughout the history of the Jewish religion didn't do that willingly, but we are to willingly give ourselves. And we think about sacrifice, and we think about our next topic that we're going to look at. And it wasn't mentioned at the time, but what did the Hebrew writer, whoever that was, say about Abel? He offered a better sacrifice. How? By faith. It was by faith that Abel offered a better sacrifice than Cain. And that's what we're going to be talking about faith. And the Bible defines faith, and for us as believers, this is quite an acceptable definition. Hebrews 11 and verse 1. Faith is the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen. That's a summary. Let's put some details on that skeleton. Let's define faith using human sources. Starting with a Christian perspective, J.D. Davis wrote an old dictionary of the Bible, and he defined faith as assent, agreement, to testimony united with trust. We've heard the old saying, God said it, I believe it, that settles it. God said it, I'll agree with that 100%. I believe it, I'll agree with that 100%. That settles it implies that there can be no doubt about anything. I don't accept that part. There can be doubt. But we accept what God says. Now, when you get into really secular sources, then you get sort of differing definitions. I have an old Webster's New World Dictionary, 1960 version, which defines faith as unquestioning belief. I wouldn't go that far. We can question. We're going to see that later. And faith doesn't mean that we have to have seen something to know that it's true. Would any of you like to stand up and deny that Abraham Lincoln was a historical character? I don't think so. None of us would deny that the Greek poet Homer was a historical character, or that Hammurabi, the Sumerian king who lived before the time of Abraham, was historical. They lived. We didn't see them, but we know they lived. And by the same token, first century references to Jesus, not in here, but elsewhere, are such that no one can really deny that Jesus lived. We can go back to contemporary sources. Josephus was a Jewish historian. He was born a little bit after Jesus died and went back to heaven. Josephus wasn't convinced that Jesus was the Son of God. But he also wasn't convinced that he wasn't. He left room for doubt. That's a basically contemporaneous reference to Jesus. The Roman historian Tacitus, same thing, refers to Jesus as a man. Other writers who talked about Jesus as a man, did that confirm his deity? No. but it did confirm that he lived. Unquestioning Belief from 1960. When you get into internet versions, internet definitions like Wikipedia, they become more anti-religious. You can see what society has done since 1960. Has it become better? Has it become more spiritual? I doubt it. It's gone the other way. Here are some definitions. Complete trust or confidence in someone or something. Well, that word trust, that kind of goes back to J.D. Davis. Here's another one. Strong belief in God or in the doctrines of a religion based upon spiritual apprehension rather than proof, based upon how you perceive it in your own mind. In other words, it's true for you, but it doesn't have to be true for me. And they talk about proof. Does the Bible try to prove that God exists? It doesn't. It assumes it from the very beginning that God exists. And God has done what he's done, will do what he will do. Not with proof, but just assuming it. If there were concrete proof that God existed, there really wouldn't be any need for faith. So the Bible does not provide it. It provides lots of evidence, but not what you could call concrete proof. But Christians believe. We believe. And we believe we have lots of reasons. Because our faith is built, it relies upon every statement that God has made. God has made them. We believe them.
But the things which God has created proves that he exists.
That's the argument from Romans chapter 1. Prove to Jim, absolutely. To the skeptic, they still don't. Now, those who do not accept those demonstrations of God's power, you can look outside today, it's a pretty day. Did that just come into being just because something blew up billions of years ago? A tiny little dot? I think that's the way the Big Bang Theory is described, that all of the universe came out of a little dot of matter. That transcends understanding. That can't be. That's true. What caused it to happen? And how could everything come out of one little dot? If that's so, we need to figure that out. And those of us with weight problems, well, we could lose our weight in a hurry. It can't be. But it is by faith, Hebrews 11:3, we understand that the universe was formed at God's command, so that what is seen was not made out of what was visible. Or man shall not live by bread alone, but by every word that proceeds from the mouth of God. Matthew 4 and verse 4. Or faith comes by hearing, and hearing by the word of God. Romans 10, verse 17. And faith comes from being open to those words, to hearing what God says and evaluating it, not just rejecting it, as so many people do. And faith goes way, way beyond just believing. Most atheists, going back to what we sort of mentioned earlier, most atheists will believe that Jesus existed. He was a man. He lived here. He died. They accept that. They don't accept that he's the Son of God, but they believe that he was a man just like us. Atheists believe that fact. Or James chapter 2, verse 19, written to Christians, you believe there's one God. You do well. Even the demons believe, and they tremble. But our faith is so often ridiculed, tends to be by the upper crust in our society, regardless of what field they are in. Certainly in the universities, it's rampant. And the news media, it's rampant. Among a lot of politicians, it's rampant. And it's reflected, I found a quote from Joe Klein, whom I've heard of, but amazingly, I tried to look him up on the internet and I couldn't find a reference. But in Time magazine, May 17th, 2004, he's talking about you, and here's what he said. Faith without doubt leads to moral arrogance, the eternal pratfall of the religiously convinced. In other words, people, you are morally arrogant. So says Joe Klein. And that's what a lot in society think of you. You believe in God. How silly. Because you can't prove that he exists. And if you can't prove it, it didn't happen. We believe. And sometimes we doubt. And there's nothing wrong with doubt. Is doubt the opposite of faith? No, it's not. What is the opposite of faith? It's unbelief. That's the opposite of faith. David, in some of the Psalms, expressed doubt when things were going badly for him. John the Baptist baptized Jesus. But you go on a little to Matthew chapter 11, if you want to turn there. Matthew 11, verses 2 and 3. When John had heard in prison about the works of Christ, he sent 2 of his disciples and said to him, they said to him, are you the coming one, or do we look for someone else? John doubted. Maybe he wanted his message confirmed. Maybe he just wanted his disciples to have their faith strengthened by talking to Jesus. And what was Jesus' response? Go back to John and tell him what you've heard and what you have seen about the teachings that I have made, about the miracles that have been done. And Burton Kaufman, in his commentary on this passage, talks about faith that wavers, faith that isn't always constant and steady. And I don't think any of us would say that our faith has never wavered. Here's what Kaufman said. It should be noted that in times of personal misfortune, suffering, hardship, or persecution, one's faith is inclined to waver. And those things which seem so positive and certain under more favorable circumstances and in brighter days tend to be dimmed and obscured. We've seen that. We've seen that in our own lives. When things have been going swimmingly for us, it's easy for our faith to be strong. But when we are struck with a serious illness, or when we lose our jobs and we're afraid we might lose our house, or when someone really close to us dies, it's easy for our faith to waver, to be shaken. And there's nothing wrong with that. Consider John's case. He was in prison. He probably had no prospect of release. And he didn't know the circumstances of what was going to lead to his death, but he probably figured it's not going to be very far off. And it's possible that he may have expected something of Jesus that Jesus wasn't going to deliver. That is, the commander on the white horse to drive out the Romans. Jesus hadn't done that. And I don't know that John was looking for that, but a lot of the Jews were, and they were disappointed. But why was Jesus doing that? Keeping a relatively low profile? Well, he didn't want to arouse opposition, to bring it to a point where something had to happen until his ministry had been completed. And that's why in the Gospel of John, 3 times it's stated, his hour had not yet come. If Jesus had pushed it, his ministry might have lasted 3 months and he'd have been killed. Wouldn't have been long enough. And as we deal with doubts, our faith, rather than becoming weaker, can become stronger. And that's why we read in James chapter 1 and verse 3 that the testing of our faith produces endurance. It makes it stronger. It makes it stronger as we recognize that God is not in the business of satisfying our every whim. But as Paul wrote in 1 Timothy chapter 6, if we have food and clothing, that should be enough. We don't have to live in luxury. Not necessary. Our faith can become stronger as we realize that we don't have all the answers to life as to why things happen, both good things and bad things. We don't have all those answers. We don't need all those answers. We need to rely on God and accept what happens. And as we persevere in our faith, like James wrote, it becomes stronger. And also as we recognize that we don't have to be certain about everything. Consider Job, one of the wealthiest men of his day, a godly man. And look what happened to him. Did he ever learn why those things had happened? He didn't. He was never told. Did Job question God? Why these things are happening to me? He did. He didn't get an answer. But did Job yield to his wife, who said, just curse God and die? Things are so bad. Just curse God. He didn't do that either. He persevered, not knowing why. And toward the end, he was rewarded with more than he had had. Never explained. But we can doubt. Godly people have doubted, and they were not condemned for it. So let's look at Scripture. Let's look at some references to faith. Let's think about the Old Testament. Let's say that you are going to do an extensive study of faith in the Old Testament. And you want to finish it by noon today. You can do it. Guess how many times the word faith is mentioned in the Old Testament? 2. 2 times. Here's the first one. Turn to Deuteronomy chapter 32. Deuteronomy 32. First mention of faith. It's speaking of Israel. Israel that had been brought out of Egypt and sustained in the wilderness. But their confidence, their trust in God was so up and down. And this is what the Lord said. I will hide my face from them. I will see what their end will be. For they are a perverse generation, children in whom is no faith. Half of the uses of faith in the Old Testament, right there. Here's the other half. Habakkuk 2 and verse 4. The just shall live by his faith. Two references. We're more familiar with that one because it's cited 3 times in the New Testament. In Romans 1, verse 17, in Galatians 3, verse 11, in Hebrews 10, verse 38. And the reference there may be to personal faith, but it's just as likely that it's referring to the faith that we read about in Acts 6 and verse 7, that increasing numbers of the priests were obedient to the faith. What is the faith? It's Christianity. It's not what's in our own minds. It's the body of teaching about Christ. Not personal belief, but foundational. So that's your study of faith in the Old Testament. 2 words. We completed it in about 5 minutes. Now, there are lots of words that go at the concept of faith, but not translated as such. A very common one is believe, numerous times. Genesis 15 and verse 6. Who would it be writing about? Abraham. And he believed in the Lord, and he, that is God, counted it to him as righteousness. That also is quoted in the New Testament. Or Psalm 119, verse 66. Teach me good judgment and knowledge, for I believe your commandments. And sometimes belief is tied with action. Consider the prophet Jonah. He went to Nineveh with a message. 40 days, and Nineveh shall be overthrown. Did the Ninevites believe him? Yeah, they did. And what did they do? They repented in hopes that God would not do what Jonah was saying. And they got a reprieve of probably over 150 years. Not exactly sure when Jonah lived, but a good assumption is in between 800 and 750 BC. Nineveh fell to the Babylonians in 606. They got a long reprieve because they repented. And Israel had belief at some times, but they were fickle in it. And fickle belief, fickle faith, isn't worth a whole lot. In Psalm 106 and verse 12, David is writing about the deliverance from Egypt. And he says, then they believed his words. But in the next verse, Psalm 106:13, but they soon forgot his works. They did not wait for his counsel. And sometimes we forget what God has done for us. There's an old song, "Oh, for a closer walk with God." And a lot of you are old people. I'm old too. And we can remember that song. We can remember a line from it. Where is the blessedness I knew when first I saw the Lord? It so often fades. And we can remember back to the time of our baptism and how enthusiastic we were about being a Christian. And we can look back at that, and so often we can wonder what happened. Where is that blessedness? It gets away. And those works that God had done, those words that God had shared with Israel, they came, they went. And as a result, they sinned. We need to keep them foremost. So, belief is one of the words. Trust is another. That harks back to J.D. Davis in his definition. About half of the uses of the word trust are in the Psalms. And trusting in God brings some wonderful blessings. And I want us to look at a number of scriptures, and we will probably about get finished with them before this class period finishes. The first one is protection. Trust in God brings protection. Turn to 2 Samuel chapter 22 in verse 3. David has been delivered from enemies, one of whom was King Saul. And David said, "The Lord is my rock, my fortress, my deliverer, the God of my strength. In him I will trust. My shield, the horn of my salvation, my stronghold, my refuge, my Savior. You save me from violence." Protection. Psalm 25 and verse 2. "O my God, I trust in you. Let me not be ashamed. Let not my enemies triumph over me." That sounds familiar. "Unto thee, O Lord, do I lift up my soul." We sing that song. Or in Nahum chapter 1 and verse 7, "The Lord knows those who take refuge in him." Trust brings protection. Trust brings blessings. From Psalm 34, verse 8, "Taste and see that the Lord is good. Blessed is the man who trusts in him." All of us can look at our lives and say our trust in the Lord has blessed us. If we couldn't say that, we wouldn't be sitting where we are today, because we've seen it demonstrated over and over in our own lives. It brings blessings. It brings rejoicing. From Psalm 5, verse 11. "Let all those rejoice who put their trust in you. Let them ever shout for joy because you defend them." He's brought the idea of protection into that verse. "Let those also who love your name be joyful in you." It brings rejoicing. it brings peace. Isaiah chapter 26, verse 3. You will keep him in perfect peace, whose mind is stayed on you, because he trusts in you. And finally, turn back to Isaiah 12. It brings salvation. Chapter 12, verse 2. Behold, God is my salvation. I will trust and not be afraid, because Yahweh the Lord is my strength and my song. He also has become my salvation. Trust, one of the concepts of faith. Hope, another one, from several Hebrew words. About a third of the uses of hope are in the Psalms. And the most common meaning of it is expectation. It's confidence. People go to come and go, and they buy those lottery things. Do they hope to win the lottery? Yeah. Do they expect to win the lottery? No. Because that's not the way gambling works. I have said before that gambling is a zero-sum game. For one person to win, somebody else has got to lose, because it doesn't create any money. And not only that, the state takes its share. It's a losing proposition all the way around. That's what gambling is. But hope for us, for God's people, is not just a long shot. It's confidence. Psalm 16 and verse 9. Therefore my heart is glad, my glory rejoices, my flesh also will rest in hope. And he goes on. Paul cited this on his first journey in Acts chapter 13. Because you will not abandon me to the grave. He's speaking of Christ. Jesus died, he was buried, but his body didn't decay because it was raised. His soul was not abandoned to the grave. We have hope for delivery from death. We don't die like Rover all over. We don't die like the unbeliever who has no hope, but who probably dies with a fear that maybe what I have been hearing about Christianity and God is true. I don't want to find out. We have hope for delivery from death because we are under the protective eye of God. He is looking out for us. That's Psalm 33, verses 18 and 19. We have hope for redemption from Psalm 130. We hope in God, we trust in God, and he will redeem us. And we have hope for salvation. Turn to Lamentations. Remember, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Lamentations, Ezekiel, Daniel, that's where he is. Sometimes when you get into the prophets in the latter part of the Old Testament, you have to kind of go through them in your head. Oh, that's where he is. Okay. I had to do that too. Lamentations chapter 3, verses 24 through 26. And Lamentations is just what it says. It's a lament. Jeremiah is so sad about what's happening to Jerusalem. But listen to what he wrote. Let's start in verse 22. Through the Lord's mercies we are not consumed. His compassions fail not. They are new every morning. Great is your faithfulness. The Lord is my portion, says my soul, therefore I hope in him. We sing a song like that. The Lord is good to those who wait for him, to the soul who seeks him. It is good that one should hope and wait quietly for the salvation of the Lord. While hoping, wait quietly. Maintain your confidence that God will do as he has promised. Remain confident that God will rescue, that he will deliver, that he will help. And he will do that because of his own nature, not because that we are good people, wonderful people, that God needs us. He doesn't. But he will do it because he loves us. And so that trust isn't built on our own works. It's built on God. Psalm 37, verse 3, if we trust in God, if we do good, then good things will happen in this life. Generally, that's true. But we all know of faithful Christians who've had it devastatingly hard in this life. They grew up poor. They have been sick throughout their lives. Things have gone south for them. They lived in poverty, but they maintained their faith. But generally, if we trust in God, things will work out. Or Psalm 18, verse 2, the Lord is my rock, my fortress, my deliverer, my God, my strength, in whom I will trust, my shield, the horn of my salvation, my stronghold. Trust in the Lord, not in your own understanding. You've heard that. It's Proverbs 3 and verse 5. If we trust in ourselves, it is self-defeating. And actually, in Proverbs 28, we read, he who trusts in his own heart is a fool. If we trust in ourselves to make it to heaven, we are foolish. If we trust in physical things instead of God, it won't work. Hosea chapter 10 and verse 13 says that Israel would fail. Why? Because they trusted in armies. So, summarizing the Old Testament, faith translated as such 2 times. But the concept, believe, trust, hope, it's all through it. There's a lot more said in the New Testament. The word faith comes from the Greek word pistis. In the Old Testament, from the Hebrew, 2 times. In the New Testament, more than 500. We'll start there next week. Thank you, sir. I appreciate that. I will do my best. I will put on my mask.